These are the prairies of Alberta in Western Canada. 70 million years ago, dinosaurs lived here. Their remains are found along the valley of the Red Deer River, where wind and water have eroded the soil to form badlands. It's to these badlands that dinosaur hunters come, looking for fossils as they weather out of the ground. Dinosaurs were the largest and most successful creatures that ever lived. They dominated the Earth for 120 million years. Trying to explain their success has always caused fierce debates. In this program, we present the views of one group of paleontologists who think they've found the reasons for it. Today, dinosaurs are being given a surprising new image. What were dinosaurs like? How did they live? In Hollywood, at least, they thought they had the answers. For scientists, making sense of these monsters with strange-sounding names has always been difficult. Stegosaurus, a plant eater. The gigantic brontosaurs, the largest dinosaurs of all. Iguanodon, one of the first discovered. The terrifying Tyrannosaurus rex. All these creatures have been argued over ever since they were first discovered. At the center of one long-running debate have been sauropods, like the brontosaurs. At Harvard University is one of the new dinosaur revolutionaries, Bob Backer. He's been interested in the way ideas about these creatures have evolved.
This is a sauropod dinosaur. Well, I generally draw sauropods or any other type of dinosaurs. First, a quick sketch of the outlines of the bones, and on that I add the major muscles, modeled of them as the fossil bones indicate. And you can make quite an accurate model of a dinosaur or any other fossil animal because the size and shape of the muscles is indicated by the marks on the bones. Now, about 1905, there was some strong criticism of some of the research done on American sauropods by European scientists. According to the Europeans, the sauropods should be restored like true reptiles, with their upper arms and their upper legs splayed out to the side, like an enormous lizard. An American paleontologist, Holland, pointed out we run into serious difficulties with our sauropods if we put the upper leg bones splayed out to the side like a lizard. It's a sauropod from a rear view, great flaring pelvis, rather deep in the lower pelvic bones, but the ribs are even deeper, extending way below the pelvis. If you splay out the legs, you've got an animal whose rib cage goes way beyond his feet. And Holland points out, you then have to dig a trench for the dinosaur so that he can walk around like a lizard with his deep rib cage. And Holland suggested this is one reason sauropods went extinct, because it's bad mentally and biologically to run in a rut. Well, that's mostly nonsense. Getting back to reasonable restoration of a sauropod, suggested by American scientists that these animals were so big, so enormous, they couldn't possibly support their weight on dry land. They had to use water to buoy themselves up. And the long neck was for breathing, with just the tip of the head exposed above the high water mark of the lake or swamp. There's a problem with this restoration, pointed out a couple of years ago. The nostrils are here, the lungs are here. The pressure of so many meters of water would collapse the lungs. It'd be virtually impossible to draw air down through here. There's no evidence of the strengthened cartilage or bony tubes that whales have to prevent the windpipe from collapsing.
Arguments continue because evidence is scarce. What evidence there is comes from expeditions like this one 50 years ago to the Red Deer River in Alberta. These hills were once the richest dinosaur hunting grounds of all. In their heyday, they saw a kind of paleontological gold rush. Often, all that was found was a single bone, and getting it out sometimes jumbled the remains still further. Competition was fierce. These early collectors were often less interested in understanding dinosaurs than in getting their specimens back to their museum ahead of their rivals. In the early days, the fossil bones gathered with such great effort from the earth were the only clues to what dinosaurs had been like. Back in museum workshops, months of painstaking effort were needed to prepare the skeletons. Without a plan to work with, the bones were simply fitted together like the parts of some bizarre jigsaw puzzle. There is always uncertainty, yet with careful analysis, the bones can reveal a wealth of information about the long-dead animal. According to Bob Backer, the evidence from skeletons suggests that some of the gigantic sauropods, for example, had rather extraordinary eating habits.
The most advanced sauropods, ones with the most specialized bony structure, are Diplodocus and Brontosaurus. Now, these animals have very peculiar proportions: enormous pelvic girdle, enormous upper thigh bone, very, very short back, powerful forelimb, but a short forelimb, and a tail structure which is just full of muscular processes and strength. Well, reviewing all this evidence, seemed to me that this is a suite of adaptations for standing on the hind legs and tail, rearing up on the body, pushing the neck up, and feeding very high in the foliage. And it was pointed out by the older American paleontologists that right here, on the base of the tail, where it would touch the ground in this tripodal stance, very often you find damaged vertebra in Diplodocus and Brontosaurus, indicating pressure, great weight was applied there. Illustrating that our interpretations of sauropods and our interpretations in dinosaurs in general go through waves of reinterpretation. And some of these waves are rediscovering the very good work, the very logical analysis that had been done by some of the earliest observers.
Dinosaur bones are only one source of information. Present-day animals are another. Neil Alexander is Professor of Zoology at Leeds University. His main research interest is analysing how animals move. Recently, he's found a way of applying his work to answering a seemingly impossible question. How fast did dinosaurs walk? On the beach at Southport, some vital evidence was laid out.
These are replicas of some of the biggest footprints ever found. They're found in Texas. They're not new footprints. They're footprints made something like 100 million years ago, preserved as fossils. And we've made copies of them. We've laid them out on the beach here in the right position, so that each footprint is the right distance from the next one. Now, these big fellows, these are the hind feet. It was a four-legged animal. And these hind feet are about 3 feet long. Front feet, much smaller. Stride length here of something like 8 feet from right hind foot down to right hind foot down again. This is a replica of the bones of the animal we think made those footprints. It's the right size, but just a bit lighter than the real thing. Now here, we've got the femur. That's this bone here. The tibia and the fibula, the lower leg bones. They're from a brontosaur. The animal was about 70 feet long, from his head to the end of rather a long tail, and he weighed about 30 tons. That's just about 5 of the biggest African elephants.
Taller than a London bus, a brontosaurus was a truly enormous creature. So how fast could it move? Finding out involved some rather unusual transport. The dinosaur footprints and leg lengths are only part of the information needed. Now something called a Froude number has to be worked out. It's a mathematical formula relating the size of an animal's legs to the way its stride increases as it moves faster.
Now we're going along about 5 miles an hour, and the horse is walking. Each foot is moving in its own time. There are no 2 feet going together. We're going to speed up a bit, and then you will see the gait change. If we go up now to about 10 miles an hour, there we are. The diagonally opposite feet are moving together. The left forefoot and the right hind foot moving together. The right forefoot and the left hind foot moving together. Now if we speed up again and go further, there we are, going through a canter into a full gallop. In the gallop, we've got the 2 forefeet moving about together, the 2 hind feet moving again about together. And there we must be going at something like 20 miles an hour.
Professor Alexander has studied dozens of animals, from tiny gerbils to huge elephants, and worked out their Froude numbers. From these he's able to estimate what the Froude number for any animal of any size will be.
And so we find out what the Froude number is for the dinosaur and how fast the dinosaur was going. And it's awful slow. 2 miles an hour. Now, 2 miles an hour, that's a slow walk for a man. For something with legs 3 times as long as a man, it's a very slow walk indeed.
So, 100 million years ago, these creatures strolled around at only 2 miles per hour. But what was their top speed? That depends, it seems, on how strong their legs were. Dinosaur bones are fossilized, turned to stone, so bones from present-day animals are tested instead. This one is from the leg of a cow.
So, there we are, broken. That took 13 kilonewtons, that's just about 1 1/3 tons. So how much for the dinosaur? I calculate, scaling up from the cow bone, that the dinosaur bone would have taken just about 40 tons to break. 1 1/3 tons for the cow bone, 40 tons for the dinosaur. Now, the faster the dinosaur goes, the bigger the force that acts on its bones. And I calculate that if the dinosaur had got up to 12 miles an hour, the force on this bone would have been just about 40 tons. If the dinosaur had trotted, it would have broken its legs.
So if you're a brontosaur, don't trot. Right from the beginning, just one group of living animals has dominated thinking about dinosaurs. These giant reptiles are Komodo dragons, lizards that can grow up to 10 feet in length and weigh 300 pounds. Dinosaur actually means terrible lizard, and the skeletons of dinosaurs are similar to these reptiles in many ways. So, like lizards, dinosaurs were thought of as sun-basking, slow-moving, cold-blooded creatures. Now that basic model has been challenged. It all started with a new dinosaur being studied at Yale University by Professor John Ostrom.
We have right over here one that I discovered myself, which I think is one of the most interesting dinosaurs that's ever been found. In fact, I also think it's one of the most important dinosaurs ever found. Let me show you some very interesting things about this fellow. First of all, it's a carnivorous dinosaur, but not a big one like Tyrannosaurus. It's just a little fella, probably about 4 or 5 feet high, maybe about 8 or 9 feet in length. Weighed maybe about 175 pounds, about your weight or mine. Perhaps this will show you how big Deinonychus was. This is the thigh bone, or femur, and you see it's just about the same size as mine. One of the curious things about him is the construction of his foot. And the peculiar thing about this is the very large sickle-like claw on the one toe. And remember that in addition to this long bony claw, there was a horny sheath that fit over that, so that the total claw was probably half again as long. Obviously not designed for walking, and quite certainly an offensive weapon. This strange structure, which we had never seen before in any of the carnivorous dinosaurs, is the reason that I coined the name for this, that I did. Terrible Claw, Deinonychus. But he was a fellow I wouldn't want to meet on a dark street at night, I'll tell you. This was another surprise in Deinonychus. Here we have a series of tail vertebrae running from the tip of the tail up to the base of the tail, a total length of maybe about 4 feet. And the unusual thing about this series is the fact that tendons along the tail that normally are soft tissue have turned to bone, and they're ossified. And as far as I know, this is the first time that this particular kind of structure has ever turned up in a carnivorous dinosaur. When we first saw it, I really didn't know what to think. But then, remember the terrible claw? You think about that foot with that big sickle-like claw that he must have used as a weapon. Remember, he's a two-legged animal, can't walk on all fours. He's got to walk on his hind legs. How is he going to use that claw if he's standing on 2 feet? Impossible. He's got to jump around, leap around, using that claw to strike out at whatever prey or animal he's after. This means that he must have been extremely agile, very quick, good balance control, means a high neurological development. And this tail, that reinforces that picture, because here we have essentially a balancing pole. So like a tightrope walker on a tightrope was his balancing pole. So the picture that we get from Deinonychus seems to be completely different from the old picture that we had of dinosaurs as sort of sluggish, sun-basking animals like modern lizards and turtles. Deinonychus seems to be a very quick, agile, fast-moving, two-legged predator, quite unlike that old model. And this is the picture, this discovery is what sort of pushed me over the brink into looking at dinosaurs in a whole new light.
Other dinosaurs, too, were suddenly seen as fast-moving, agile creatures. And Ostrom's new ideas about them developed like this. In the animal world, there's a major division. In one group, there are mammals, which are active, hot-blooded creatures. In the other are reptiles, which are generally less active and cold-blooded. Where do dinosaurs fit? Since, like mammals, they were very active, Ostrom reasoned perhaps they were hot-blooded too. It was a startling idea, and it sent paleontologists back to look more closely at living animals. Why can mammals, like this pony, remain so active for so long? At Harvard University's field station, studies like this of an animal's oxygen consumption provide part of the answer.
Come on, Peg. Good girl, Peg. Good girl, Peg. Good girl. Good girl.
Like most mammals, the pony has large lungs and an efficient heart for pumping oxygenated blood round its body. As it runs faster, its rate of using oxygen gradually rises, and it can gallop like this for prolonged periods. By contrast, most reptiles have poor lungs and primitive hearts. They run out of oxygen before long. But there is a second factor which governs activity. To operate efficiently, all animals have to maintain their body's temperature within certain limits. Reptiles, which are ectotherms, achieve this by using heat from outside to keep warm. Mammals and birds use a different method. They are endotherms. They burn up food inside themselves and create their own heat. So, as Dr. Philip Riegel at the University of Minnesota explains, strictly speaking, it's an oversimplification to call reptiles cold-blooded.
Now, this so-called cold-blooded vertebrate is, in fact, a warm-blooded vertebrate, and it has a body temperature that's pretty close to yours and mine. We have a body temperature of around 37 degrees centigrade. This has a body temperature of around 35 degrees centigrade, which is pretty close. It does it through a variety of behaviors, and one of them is shuttling behavior, moving in and out of the sun. But it can do some more sophisticated things, too, and fine-tune its behavior, its temperature regulation. For example, let's say you're the sun, by facing the sun, its scales become little umbrellas, and they shade the animal and reduce the heat gain. But by turning its back to the sun can shine down between the scales, and it can pick up heat at a more rapid rate that way. So by adjusting its orientation to the sun, it can fine-tune its temperature regulation.
At the University of Paris, they're doing unique work on fossil dinosaur bones. The first step is to slice a stone bone into sections. Dr. Armand de Ricles and his colleagues have been working on this project for 11 years. In that time, they've examined hundreds of different dinosaur specimens from all over the world. Each stone slice is ground and polished until it's paper thin and you can see through it. They're interested in these structures within the fossil. Although it's 150 million years since this was living bone, the process of fossilization has preserved every detail. Each minute cell, every blood vessel, is still faithfully represented in stone. They are valuable evidence for the type of animal dinosaurs were, because they may relate to the activity of the living animal. Dr. de Ricles compares dinosaur bones with those of modern animals like this lizard. Its skeleton is similar to a dinosaur's in many ways, but he is the first to compare the inside of lizard and dinosaur bones in detail. Under the microscope, the lizard's densely packed bone cells show up. There's no clear shape to the cells and no visible boundaries between adjacent cells. This fox's lifestyle was very different from the lizard's. Like other hot-blooded mammals, it would have grown faster and had a higher metabolic rate. Its cells are quite unlike the lizard's. They have a distinct oval shape, and there are many blood capillaries. So what pattern lies inside the dinosaur bones? Over the years, in the hundreds of specimens he's examined, Dr. de Ricles has found many individual differences, but a clear pattern has emerged. Each tiny fossil section shows dozens of oval dinosaur cells, with plenty of blood capillaries. This is the same at higher magnification. And this is the fox. The similarity between it and the dinosaur is remarkable. The lizard's bone again, clearly different from both dinosaur and fox. There is still dispute about how these bone differences relate to living animals. Yet on this evidence, dinosaurs do seem more like mammals than reptiles. A second line of evidence comes from what happens when animals exercise. This hot-blooded endotherm is the largest living two-legged animal, the ostrich. Exercise makes animals hot, and like other hot-blooded animals, and unlike cold-blooded reptiles, she has elaborate mechanisms for losing heat.
See the gular area opening and closing there. She'll bend down.
The gular area in her throat moves in a version of panting, a common cooling mechanism.
I guess you can't get her around to see her. Yeah, she is hot now. We're going to have to probably take her outside and let her cool down shortly.
The second cooling mechanism is a bold lifting of her feathers so she exposes large areas of naked skin.
And the large joint you can see down in here is a knee, and the ankle is the joint below that. There, she's exposing a lot of skin. She's going to come out in a hurry, I think.
Animals have developed a variety of cooling mechanisms. If dinosaurs were hot-blooded, they would have needed cooling mechanisms too. So Professor John Ostrom and his student Jim Farlow started investigating a most unlikely animal.
And this is Stegosaurus, one of the most absurd and ridiculous-looking animals that ever evolved. You know, it looks like a blimp on stilts with all those funny plates up on its back. Let's climb up here topside and take a closer look at these plates. They're the distinctive features of Stegosaurus. One of the first things that we notice are at the bases of every plate are punctured by a series of very large holes or openings, canals of some sort. And we thought that this was peculiar, so to find out what it might mean, we sectioned one of these plates, put it in plaster, and cut it across in a series of slices to see what the internal structure might look like. And this is the result. You can see that there are some very large openings in the center, surrounded by areas of very small pores or openings. To me, this clearly means that these bony plates, instead of being solid, were flushed with large volumes of blood. That only makes sense to me if these features were cooling devices.
To find out if the plates were efficient at cooling, they got help from Yale Engineering Department, Professor Dan Rosner.
This is a wind tunnel in which we have a model mounted and can pass air over this model at very high speeds. In the model, we have an electrical heater, which we can control. In addition, we have a temperature gauge, the output of which is displayed on this instrument. If we turn off the wind, then the model will heat up rather quickly. If I turn on the wind, the model will cool off rapidly, as indicated by these readings here again.
This is a simulated Stegosaurus body. On it, they mounted various sizes and arrangements of fins and tested their cooling efficiency. The best cooling system turned out to be 2 staggered rows of fins, exactly like the arrangement found on stegosaurs in 2 long rows along their backs.
How about the best choice of shape for the individual plate? Well, considering the fact that the air along the back of Stegosaurus is heated and retarded, then those areas of the plate which are immersed in the heated region of the flow near the Stegosaurus body are relatively ineffective. One might as well cut corners at that location. Similarly, it's difficult for heat to get to the extremities of these plates, and it makes sense for a minimum weight configuration to cut corners at the plate extremities.
So Stegosaurus had an ideal design for a cooling system, and it could even have regulated its temperature by turning in and out of the wind. So what can be deduced from all this?
That leads me to conclude that these animals must have been warm-blooded. This is strong evidence, I think, for endothermy in dinosaurs.
Another line of evidence, and the most sophisticated, applies not just to one dinosaur, but to a whole range of them, those that eat other dinosaurs. In Ottawa, Dr. Dale Russell.
I'm speaking to you within the body cavity of a tyrannosaur, a large Cretaceous carnivorous reptile from Alberta, which was somewhat smaller in stature than the true Tyrannosaurus rex. Surely it's an experience that would not have been envied by many of its contemporaries. As you can see by the length of the hind limbs, the animal was extremely fleet. There's nothing sluggish or massive about the creature as far as the structure of its hind limbs is concerned. It can certainly cover the ground. In contrast, the forelimbs are extremely small, although they're relatively large in this genus. You can see that it only had 2 fingers in its hand, and actually the elbow joint was broken in life and incorrectly rehealed. Probably the forelimb was not a very essential part of the anatomy of a tyrannosaur. It all seems to begin right here. This skull is extremely large, and the teeth are also large and widely separated. Peculiarly, the jaw muscles themselves are not particularly powerful, but the neck itself is built in a very strong bulldog-like fashion. Probably these creatures rushed out from a hiding place, seized their prey by their jaws, and simply dug in their heels and tore the animal apart using the inertia of its own body and the struggles of the prey animal. In the course of such a spectacular scenario, the animal would simply tear chunks of living flesh from the body of its prey, spreading blood, perhaps viscera, and muscle masses attached to tendons from the skeleton. Probably it left a very messy meal, and smaller carnivores cleaned up the mess behind, eating the muscle tissue and the viscera and the bits and pieces that a tyrannosaur scattered in great abundance around its kill. So you can readily appreciate that an animal of this size, of this stature, of this sleekness and rapidity of motion, the horrible appearance of the mouth, the warty nose, must have been a very impressive thing to see in action in the late Cretaceous of Western Canada.
This is the butcher's shop at the London Zoo. They're preparing a week's rations for just one of today's largest living carnivores, a lion. Surprisingly, the lion's eating habits provide the basis for some startling conclusions about the eating habits of dinosaurs. A 300-pound lion will eat one of these 10-pound joints every day for 6 days in every week. In just 5 weeks, he'll eat his own weight in raw steak. Lions eat so much because they need to make a lot of heat just to keep warm. Whether they're lazing in the zoo or racing after antelope, most of the food they eat is converted straight into heat. Most other typical mammals and birds also use their food in the same way. But here, on the other side of the zoo, feeding is much less expensive and less frequent. In the reptile house, these Nile crocodiles weigh about the same as the lions, but since they're cold-blooded ectotherms, they have very different feeding habits.
Well, they haven't been fed for a fortnight now, and the way things are going, they don't look like they're going to be fed for another fortnight. They're not very hungry at the moment, and this is fairly usual with these sort of animals. They don't feed very much, and we have quite a job predicting how much food to get down for them.
In fact, they eat only 1/8 of the food eaten by the lions, just 1 pound of fish for every 8 pounds of steak. The reason is that cold-blooded animals don't have to make their own heat. They get it from their surroundings. In the wild, this is reflected by the balance of nature. A certain weight of prey fish will support a certain weight of predator crocodiles. There's a fixed ratio of crocodiles to fish. Because crocodiles don't eat much, this predator-prey ratio is a high one. In other words, there are lots of crocodiles for a given weight of fish. There's also a predator-prey ratio for the big cats. It's quite different from the crocodiles. The high food requirements mean that only a few predator cats can live off a herd of antelope. This time, the predator-prey ratio is low, very few cats for a given weight of prey. Bob Backer uses predator-prey ratios as the basis for his own research into hot-bloodedness. He wants to find out when it first arose in the fossil record. He starts, long before dinosaurs, with these primitive reptiles. They lived millions of years before the first dinosaur, yet Backer believes he can still decide whether their fossil bones came from cold or hot-blooded animals.
This is the place to begin in a reconstruction of the evolution of energetics. These are fossil vertebrates from the earliest evolutionary stage, very primitive reptiles, very primitive amphibians. Most of the specimens in these cases are either plant eaters or fish eaters. For the top carnivore, the top predator, we go to these banks, and they contain bones of Dimetrodon, the lion equivalent in this fauna. Very different sorts of teeth here. This big flesh eater has pointed teeth with keels in the back and the front. This animal would have had a head 2 or 2.5 feet long, a very large individual. Powerful enough to kill, cut up, and eat any of the contemporary animals. This is the top predator. Practically this entire bank of shelves is this top predator, the biggest flesh eater. The other side are all possible prey items. There's nearly as many of these big flesh eaters as they are all possible prey. The ratio is about 7 to 10, 7 big carnivores to big prey items. That's nice. That's exactly what we'd expect in a very primitive, cold-blooded community, all ectotherms, where the energy utilization is very low. Each Dimetrodon needed only a few kills per year. Each Dimetrodon had a low heat production. You have a high predator-prey ratio.
So, like crocodiles, these were cold-blooded reptiles. What of their successors a few million years later?
This next evolutionary level is the mammal-like reptiles. It's a model of one, Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus was a plant eater. All of these are plant eaters with beaks. There's some plant eaters with crushing teeth. The carnivores are very rare. As a matter of fact, all our carnivores from these mammal-like reptile faunas contained in this one row. Here's an excellent skull, a big predator. It's enormous canines, enormous joral muscles. This is powerful enough to kill or eat most of his contemporaries. We have very few of these, only a half dozen. The predator-prey ratio drops dramatically, going from those primitive reptiles to these mammal-like reptiles. And consistently, wherever they're found, mammal-like reptiles have low ratios of carnivores. Well, I take that as one strong indication that here we have the evolution of endothermy, the first time it appears. The low ratios of mammal-like reptiles continue And then mammal-like reptiles are replaced by dinosaurs themselves. Well, what's the ratio in dinosaurs? There are quite a few good collections, and nearly all of them give you a ratio of flesh eater to herbivore as low or lower than these, 10%, 5%, many times as low as 3%. I take this as powerful evidence of endothermy, high heat production, high food consumption in dinosaurs.
When animals die, whether lions or dinosaurs, they leave bones on the ground. But very, very few fossil bones will find their way into museums millions of years later. Backer's critics argue that this could cause enormous errors. He disagrees.
In East Africa, there are studies of how the bones of animals dying right now are incorporated into the sediment. And the way predator bones are incorporated seems to be not too different from the way their prey bones are incorporated. The second point is that these predator-prey values are not based on just one collection, but many collections for mammals, dinosaurs, and primitive reptiles. And taken all together, the mammals and the dinosaurs have very low numbers, and the primitive reptiles have very high. The differences are quite marked.
The arguments put forward by Backer and others are still controversial, but there's no doubt that dinosaurs were unlike lizards in lots of ways. And if it turns out dinosaurs were hot-blooded, it would explain why, like mammals, they were so successful for so long. Whatever the reasons for dinosaurs' success, their reign finally ended. 70 million years ago, they finally died out and left the way open for our mammal ancestors to take over. Why they disappeared, no one knows. Was there a sudden change of climate? Did the Earth suffer some cosmic catastrophe? Today, there are still more questions than satisfactory answers. But in these sediments in the Badlands along Alberta's Red Deer River, the end of dinosaurs is recorded for all time.
Over here is the base of this last unit, which is nearly black and almost a coal, and below it here is another layer of volcanic ash. Underneath it are a series of stream-laid sands and shales, which are not well-bedded, which are rather massive. This is the plain which marks the extinction of the dinosaurs and the end of the dinosaurian era. These sediments here contain pollen grains of plants which lived with the dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs themselves and many other animals and plants typical of that era. From this layer on up to the top, as far as you can see in this section, approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the diversity of different kinds of living things have disappeared, and among them the dinosaurs. These strata mark the beginning of the age of mammals and the onset of a new era in Earth history.
Now, in these revolutionary times for dinosaurs, even that picture is being questioned. It's being suggested that dinosaurs didn't die out. The idea started in 1970 when Professor John Ostrom was examining a small specimen labeled as a flying reptile, a pterosaur.
On that day in the fall of 70, I examined this specimen, first time I'd ever seen it. It was labeled as a pterosaur, and looking at it, I knew within a minute that it was not what it was identified as, and wondered curiously what it might have been. And so I examined it very closely and began to make out what bits and pieces were present, and noticed right away that the hind limbs which are preserved here are much too massive, much too large and robust for a pterosaur. And then, almost like that, I remember Archaeopteryx. And you can imagine, wow, I mean, every paleontologist dreams or hopes to find something like that. Archaeopteryx is universally considered as one of the most important fossils and interesting fossils that we know of.
Ostrom's excitement was understandable. Only 3 specimens of Archaeopteryx were known, worth $250,000 or more. It's also crucially important as the first known bird, even though, like an ostrich or kiwi today, it probably couldn't fly at all.
So all of a sudden I had a second thought. Now wait a minute, I've seen that same structure somewhere else. Now some of the small carnivorous dinosaurs have hands like that. And I thought, well, what is it? Is it a dinosaur or is it Archaeopteryx? And how do I tell? Well, I look for feathers. And I tipped it up to the light at a low angle, and very faint impressions of feathers there. So I knew I had another Archaeopteryx. Then another important find came to light, and that was a specimen that had actually been found in 1951. The curious thing is that for 20 years it was identified as a small carnivorous dinosaur. The reason was because there are no feather impressions, or at least they're so faint that you can't see them, can't recognize them as such. The important thing is that without feather impressions, none of these specimens would ever have been identified as birds.
So dinosaur skeletons are almost the same as the skeleton of the first bird, Archaeopteryx.
Archaeopteryx must then be very closely related to dinosaurs. In fact, the only conclusion I can come to is that Archaeopteryx, in fact, directly descended from small carnivorous dinosaurs. That means then that dinosaurs really did not become extinct, that we have their descendants around with us today, and I think that's fantastic.
To John Ostrom, these are today's dinosaurs. If his theory is right, every bird, from the budgie and the sparrow to the albatross and the pelican, has descended from a dinosaur. Dinosaurs took to the air and took their vigor and success with them.